Let's look at the process of meiosis in a female ovary. We call it oogenesis in a female, spermatogenesis in a male. But meiosis is meiosis. It follows a very similar process. But there are a few differences between male and female meiosis. The first major difference is how much occurs. If you recall, a male produces up to 300,000 sperm in a single day, whereas in a female, the female will produce one oocyte per cycle, and a cycle on average is 28 days. So there's a lot less meiosis occurring in a female. You still end up starting with a single diploid cell, and you still get 4 haploid cells. The difference is in females, only one of those 4 haploid cells that form is functional. The other 3 become what we call polar bodies. So a polar body is a cell, but the main purpose is you have to get rid of 3 sets of 23 chromosomes. You can't just leave all these chromosomes in the functional oocyte. So it's a way to get rid of these chromosomes because we want one. We want one single oocyte to form per cycle. Another difference is this process actually doesn't complete unless fertilization occurs. Fertilization doesn't occur, and it has to occur during meiosis 2. If this sperm is not here, we never get a completed meiosis 2. There's no point if the sperm isn't there. But let's start at the beginning, and you'll notice many of these names are similar, but instead of a spermatocyte, we call it an oocyte. Just like instead of calling it a spermatogonium, the stem cell, we call it an oogonium. So that oogonium populates the follicles with primary oocytes. So that oogonium has to divide by mitosis during fetal development in order to produce primary oocytes in each of the primordial follicles. During fetal development, meiosis 1 will begin. Then after birth, it stops. Pretty much everything is on hold from birth until puberty. Then once puberty starts, meiosis begins to finish. And when meiosis 1 is finished, the result is a secondary oocyte and what's known as the first polar body. In males, there were 2 secondary spermatocytes, but in females, there's 1 secondary oocyte and 1 polar body. This is actually what gets ovulated. So this stage occurs roughly at ovulation. So when ovulation happens, it's the secondary oocyte that gets ovulated, and next to it, just kind of stuck to the side of it, is this first polar body. So there's ovulation. Now, the rest of this process occurs in the fallopian tube. And if there's a sperm in the fallopian tube and the sperm begins to fertilize, then meiosis 2 finishes. And as a result of meiosis 2, you're going to have 3 polar bodies. The first polar body divides into 2 polar bodies, and those are non-functional. The secondary oocyte has to divide into what's known as the ovum. That's the cell that's in the process of fertilization, and a second polar body. So notice you have 1, 2, 3 polar bodies, and the ovum, which is getting fertilized. Once fertilization completes, we're back to a diploid cell, and it's known as the zygote. So the diploid zygote is the single cell stage of human life. Then from that stage, it's all about mitosis. So that zygote is in the fallopian tube, and it's going to begin embryonic development. That single diploid zygote becomes 2 cells. We just call that the 2-cell stage. Then 4 cells, then 8 cells, then 16 cells, then 32 cells, and that's all occurring in the fallopian tube until that developing embryo enters the uterus, and it will implant inside the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. And that occurs roughly around day 5 or 6 after fertilization. Here's another picture showing that same process, oogenesis. So this is just that same process shown on the previous slide. It just lines it also up with follicular development. But this kind of gives you an idea when these different steps are occurring. Notice in the yellow, that's all during fetal development of a female. So you've got all primordial follicles, and you've got early meiosis 1 occurring. Then that girl is born, and during childhood, nothing really occurs. Meiosis is in a kind of a holding stage, and you're still just loaded with primordial follicles. Then puberty occurs. And when puberty occurs, you're going to get gonadotropin releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, hence this starts to progress, and luteinizing hormone. So then meiosis can finish or start to complete, not in all the follicles, just in the more mature follicles. If a sperm fertilizes, we get that formation of the ovum and the 3 polar bodies. That ovum will then divide by mitosis. Well, first it'll become the zygote after fertilization. Then at mitosis, embryonic development is through the 8th week. So at the end of the 8th week after fertilization, it transitions from an embryo to a fetus. So week 9 until birth is fetal development. And then typically after birth, we call that first period neonatal, which is the first 28 days of life. These are the hormones that are in control of the female reproductive system. We're going to introduce them now, and then the next video we're going to start to coordinate these hormones and learn how they regulate the female reproductive cycle. But you'll notice this upper part is very similar to a male. You have a hypothalamus producing gonadotropin releasing hormone. That kicks off puberty. So it stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary gland. FSH tells you what it does in a female. It stimulates the initial development of ovarian follicles, so it gets them started, and then further development of ovarian follicles as they progress towards that Graafian or mature stage. LH, what does LH do? Well, LH does 2 major things. It's going to trigger ovulation. And we're going to see when we get to the cycle, that's going to be about midway through the reproductive cycle. We're going to use day 14 as the day of ovulation. Then, after ovulation, LH stimulates that empty egg carton, that empty ovarian follicle, to become the corpus luteum, that kind of collapsed in follicle. And notice what's coming from that corpus luteum. All 4 of these hormones. 2 of the 4 are produced by the developing mature follicle. So that mature follicle that's going to kind of be the one to ovulate starts to produce estrogen and inhibin before ovulation. But then after ovulation, the corpus luteum produces relaxin as well as progesterone. So now you've got all 4 of these being produced after ovulation. What do? These are just some bullet points. that you can kind of read through on your own, because we're going to be talking about each one of these hormones as we get to the cycle. But you'll notice estrogen is your female hormone that does a lot of the development of the female structures and female characteristics. Progesterone is going to be more of a pregnancy promoting hormone. It's going to prepare the female reproductive system for pregnancy. Relaxin is also a pregnancy hormone. It's going to do some things to help promote a pregnancy. You'll notice the name relaxin. It relaxes a lot of tissue like muscle. So it inhibits contractions of the uterus. So it relaxes the uterus so it can accommodate a developing organism. Towards the end of pregnancy, it relaxes the pubic symphysis. So it helps to open up the hips for childbirth. It also is involved in dilating the cervix. So the cervix can open and allow the baby to leave the uterus. So in the next video, we're going to focus 100% on the female reproductive cycle. It's going to be a 28-day cycle, and we're going to go through it in 4 stages. First stage or phase is the menstrual phase. Then we have a phase called the pre-ovulatory phase, because we're leading up to ovulation. Then the third phase is really just an event, ovulation. Then we have post-ovulatory, what happens after ovulation.